Good evening, everyone. I'm Deepak Nair from the Political Science Department, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome back to NUS Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, who will be giving his third lecture as part of the series on Singapore's foreign policy and the practice of foreign affairs. And today's lecture is on ASEAN. Mr. Kausikan.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My last lecture dealt with some fundamental structural realities of our relationships with Malaysia and Indonesia. And if I may recap very briefly, a small city-state cannot be just like its neighbors to remain relevant. It has to be extraordinary. We have to be an outlier. That we are the only ethnic Chinese majority sovereign state outside Greater China, and furthermore, a state that organizes itself horizontally, not hierarchically, adds to our uniqueness and adds also to the complications of being extraordinary. Being extraordinary does not make us universally loved. Now, the impact of these factors is most pronounced in the cases of our immediate neighbors. But it is never entirely absent in our relationships with other countries in Southeast Asia as well, although they generally manifest themselves in less obvious ways. They are an undercurrent in these relationships with the other countries in Southeast Asia, rather than the driving dynamic as in the cases of Malaysia and Indonesia. Let me give you an example. In 2006, controversy broke out when Temasek Holdings announced its plans to buy a 49% stake in Shincorp from the family of then Thai Prime Minister Thaksin. The controversy was fueled primarily by Thai domestic factors. But I wondered then, and I still wonder today, if there would have been the same degree of controversy if, say, an Indonesian or Australian or Japanese company had planned to buy a stake in Shincorp. Actually, I don't think so, and I have some reason to believe so. Now, the influence of ethnicity is even not entirely absent in our relationships with countries outside Southeast Asia. It is an ever-present undercurrent, for example, in our relationships with the US and Japan, particularly in periods when these countries' relationships with China are more than usually tense. I'll give you an example. We established diplomatic relations with Japan in 1966. But it was not until the early 2000s when we stood firm in the face of Chinese pressures in our support for Japan's aspirations to become a new permanent member of the Security Council, when other ASEAN countries succumbed to Chinese pressures, that Japan began to stop thinking of us as a Chinese country. I know this because a senior Gaimusho official, my then counterpart, told me so. Still, that perception lingers. Only a few months ago, a Japanese minister got overexcited when he overheard one of our ministers speaking in Mandarin on the sidelines of a multilateral meeting and attributed more significance to it than warranted. But our minister was speaking to a group of Cao Pao journalists. So what language should he have used? Swahili? Now, from time to time, American officials, with various degrees of subtlety, ask us whether US forces will be allowed to use our facilities in the event that they get into a conflict with China. Our honest answer is that it depends on circumstances. This is not a question that can be answered hypothetically. But the unstated underlying and persistent question in American minds is what is the effect of our demography on policy. And so we have expended a lot of time and energy to convince others that we are not a third China and that our foreign policy is independent. And we have made considerable headway in doing so. But this is always going to be a work in progress without a definitive end. In my last lecture, I also drew your attention to the tension between the imperative of a small city-state maintaining relevance by being extraordinary, by not being just another Southeast Asian country, and the unalterable fact of being located in Southeast Asia. Now, this is the existential condition of being Singapore. It will never go away. This tension, I mean. It can only be managed. So how do we manage the tension? One of the main means is ASEAN, which consequently lies at the heart of our foreign policy. ASEAN is, however, more often talked about than understood. It is an imperfect organization, but as I've pointed out in previous lectures, this is an imperfect world. We must deal with the world as it is, with the instruments at hand. In the real world of foreign policy, as distinct from the world of theory, the search for perfection is not merely futile. Seeking perfection can lead to paralysis or disaster. And as I have often pointed out elsewhere, too much criticism of ASEAN amounts to criticizing a cow for being an imperfect horse. Such criticism is utterly pointless. There are things that ASEAN can do very well. There are some things that ASEAN can do only suboptimally. And there are some things that are always going to be beyond ASEAN's powers. ASEAN is not a panacea. It is not to be taken for granted that ASEAN will always be an appropriate instrument for our foreign policy. And the art of ASEAN diplomacy lies in knowing the difference between different situations, the things that ASEAN can do very well, the things it can only do suboptimally, and the things it cannot do. Knowing that difference and suiting the instrument to the occasion or the circumstances. And we should not assume that the ASEAN instrument will always be at our disposal. Now, this general point that there are some things that ASEAN can do, some things it can do only partially, and some things it cannot do, this general point also applies to other international organizations, such as the UN. It seems axiomatic that a world governed by international law and international organizations is in the interest of small states. And we say so very often. I have done so myself. And we mean it. But is this really such a world? Not always, and not in every issue domain. So, making these distinctions, suiting the instrument to the occasion is a crucial part of diplomacy and foreign policy. Now, we cannot even begin to judge the appropriateness of the ASEAN instrument or even glimpse ASEAN's future trajectory unless we understand ASEAN's past. Much of ASEAN's history has been forgotten by ASEAN member states and ASEAN dialogue partners, and this lecture will sketch ASEAN's history in very broad strokes. By doing so, I hope to make clearer some fundamental realities about ASEAN that may not otherwise receive sufficient emphasis and that we ignore only at our peril. Southeast Asia is not a natural region as, for example, Europe or North America are natural regions defined by culture or geography or some other characteristic intrinsic to itself. ASEAN and the idea of regionalism in general required a sense of Southeast Asia distinct from Nanyang or Nanyo or East Indies or the Far East or some other broader and vaguer appellations that have been in wider usage before Southeast Asia became the accepted term. Furthermore, before there can be a region, there must be states. And the polities in Southeast Asia that existed before the coming of the West were not states, let alone nations. The Western colonial powers kept their imperial possessions separate and minimized contacts between their subjects. Colonies are not states or nations, nor are empires regions. The term Southeast Asia gained currency from the imperatives of recapturing the territories under Imperial Japanese occupation during World War II. Southeast Asia Command was then based in Colombo, in what was then Ceylon. It did not include all the territories we today understand as Southeast Asia. The Philippines was under the Pacific Command, under American Command. Nevertheless, the Japanese occupation was the only time in history when the entire area, when the entire region was under a single authority and the Allied powers had to deal with it accordingly. Now, Imperial Japan's role, although designed to serve Japanese interests and not the interests of the peoples under its rule, in catalyzing and intensifying nationalism in the territories they occupied must be acknowledged. It was an important factor. And while the experience of Japanese occupation differed in each occupied territory, it was still a broadly shared experience, albeit a bitter and harsh experience. It was a crucial stage in the evolution of state, of nation, and hence of region. And after World War II, there could be no going back. The idea of Southeast Asia as a distinct region, and eventually ASEAN, emerged from the complicated and convoluted political, diplomatic, and military dynamics set in motion by the Second World War. State formation, nation building, and region building acted and reacted on each other and shaped each other. These processes were intimately intertwined with and profoundly influenced by post-Cold War global processes of decolonization undertaken in the midst of the Cold War, which in Southeast Asia was far from cold. On the mainland, it was rather hot. Now, it will be tiresome to you and to me for me to recount every step of the convoluted diplomatic maneuvers of the 1950s and early 1960s, whereby the first experiment at regional cooperation, ASA, or the Association of Southeast Asia, emerged and finally metamorphosized into ASEAN in 1967. In between, there were diversions through Mafalindo, CFET, Southeast Asia Friendship and Economic Treaty, and SECOR, Southeast Asia Community Organization. I bet none of you have heard these terms before. With dead ends leading to CETO and ASPEC, the Asia and Pacific Council, which was a South Korean initiative, incidentally. I'm sure you didn't know that. Everybody has forgotten these things, except idiots like me. Most of these organizations have been long forgotten, and I mention them only to underscore that there was nothing inevitable about ASEAN's emergence in 1967. Nor was there anything inevitable about ASEAN's survival. It was a long journey with many a stumble along the way, and ASEAN could have easily met the same fate as the earlier experiments in regional cooperation that I mentioned. The founding members of ASEAN were divided over some very fundamental issues and did not trust each other very much. Malaysia boycotted some early ASEAN meetings because the Philippines insisted on raising its claim to Sabah at them. Confrontasi or confrontation left a legacy of deep suspicions in Malaysia and Singapore about Jakarta's intentions that were shared in lesser degree by Thailand and the Philippines. Separation left the relationship, our relationship with Malaysia, fraught with racial tension. And Singapore's execution in 1968 of 2 Indonesian Marines delayed reconciliation until 1973. Relations between Malaysia and Thailand and between the Philippines and Indonesia were also not without their own complications and tensions, mainly due to irredentist forces on their borders. But in retrospect, what was most striking about the tortuous processes leading to ASEAN's formation and its fragile first decade is that the aspiration to regional cooperation in some form was never entirely abandoned. The intensity of the commitment to regionalism by different states waxed and waned, but regionalism in some form was always seen as an element in mitigating bilateral problems, even if it was unable to entirely resolve them. And this is still ASEAN's basic function, to manage relations between its members, to ensure that there is at least a modicum of order and civility in relationships in a region where order and civility are not to be taken for granted. And in a sense, everything else we do in ASEAN, everything else we do together in ASEAN, is still a means to this end, maintaining order and civility in relationships. This general commitment to regionalism did not erase the fact that different states had different conceptions of regionalism and used regionalism for different purposes. Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Thailand saw ASEAN as a means to integrate post-Sukarno Indonesia into Southeast Asia and tame its ambitions, or at least channel them into less dangerous directions. Suharto's Indonesia retained its sense of entitlement to leadership by virtue of its size, but came to regard ASEAN as a vehicle to advance its aspirations rather than act unilaterally. Now, race. Race is an inescapable reality of Southeast Asian politics. The racial element of regionalism was explicit in one of ASEAN's precursors, Mafalindo. Mafalindo is an acronym formed from the beginnings of Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia. And they all considered themselves then as Malay peoples. Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines eyed majority ethnic Chinese Singapore suspiciously as a possible stalking horse for China and wondered whether we should be admitted into any regional organization. They eventually came to see ASEAN as a possible way of managing Singapore. Now, Singapore was initially skeptical about regionalism, and by the way, even after the formation of ASEAN, we remained one of the most skeptical members in the initial years. We were initially skeptical about regionalism because we were wary about our neighbors colluding to circumscribe our new independence. But eventually, Singapore came to regard ASEAN as a means for broadening space for maneuver and stressing our Southeast Asian identity. There are other complexities as well. As I emphasized in the previous lecture, fundamental differences of political organizing concept well-nigh guarantees that the dynamics of relations between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore is always going to be complicated. Kuala Lumpur was resentful of Indonesia's condescension towards what Jakarta regarded as his adik or younger brother, and concerned that some Malays might see in Jakarta an alternative authority. Indonesia's Javanese leadership was in turn suspicious that cultural, linguistic, and other links between the Malays of West Malaysia and Sumatra might encourage separationist tendencies, and both saw ASEAN as a means of minimizing these risks. Malaysia and Singapore, although formally non-aligned and anxious to avoid becoming embroiled in the Indochina conflict, wanted to ensure that regionalism did not weaken their defense ties to America's closest allies. Britain and Australia, Thailand and the Philippines, Britain and Australia are closest. Thailand and the Philippines were former American allies and needed some means of stressing an Asian identity. Oh, good Lord. Wait, sorry. Now this is just too big and now it's too small, okay. Now all five original members of ASEAN face internal communist insurgencies. 4 of the 5 also regarded the Western presence as a balance to Indonesia. And Suharto's new order was staunchly anti-communist, but it retained a strong commitment to non-alignment and a free and active foreign policy as central elements of its national identity. Jakarta remained opposed to Western bases in Southeast Asia as an obstacle to its aspirations of regional leadership. It's not quite well known, but I remember Mr. S.R. Nathan, our former president, who was then permanent secretary of the foreign ministry, actually no, then he was deputy secretary, telling us that we nearly walked out of the ASEAN meeting discussing the Bangkok Declaration because of the insistence of some members of ASEAN, Indonesia among them, but not alone, that all foreign bases should be removed from Southeast Asia. But a compromise was eventually found. So it was a very vital issue, and in different form, it remains quite a vital issue for us. Nor could the interests and attitudes of other Southeast Asian states and the major powers be ignored. The US and Britain regarded Southeast Asia regionalism as an element in their global strategy of containment of communism. The Soviet Union and China under Mao Zedong were unremittingly hostile towards ASEAN, which they regarded as a Cold War organization and successor to SEATO. But after the Sino-Soviet split became public, Moscow and Beijing did not conceive of their preferred regional order in exactly the same way. Now, strongly nationalist North Vietnam had its own ambitions of an Indochina Federation under its leadership as a step towards a communist Southeast Asia. Burma, as Myanmar was then called, was the only Southeast Asian country to share borders with the 2 Asian giants of India and China, and sought security in isolation. Sihanouk's Cambodia and Laos under a royalist government clung rather desperately and pathetically to the illusion of neutrality with very tragic later results. But despite all these complications, the general commitment to regionalism held ASEAN together. And the common understanding, to paraphrase the speech made by S. Rajaratnam, our first foreign minister, at the signing of the Bangkok Declaration in 1967, the common understanding was that henceforth, the political will had to be found to make the regional interest some part of the national interest. The other foreign ministers expressed much the same thought in their own ways. So compromises on conflicts of interest were eventually found. When the issue was too difficult or too sensitive, the matter was set aside until circumstances changed. One such issue was whether then divided Vietnam should be asked to join the new organization. Both Vietnams, neither Vietnam, only North Vietnam, only South Vietnam, which different countries had different preferences. In the event, membership for Vietnam, together with Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, had to await the end of the Cold War and longer. And it was not until 1999, when Cambodia was admitted, that ASEAN included all 10 countries of Southeast Asia. And ASEAN's expansion gave the term Southeast Asia a new definition, a more precise definition. Given the diversity of Southeast Asia and the internal heterogeneity of its component states, it's not surprising that ASEAN members had, and still have, different domestic and foreign priorities and interests. And it's therefore unsurprising that the trajectory of ASEAN's formation and of its subsequent evolution did not describe a smooth line or unfold at an even pace. It will never do so. The compromises we found were sometimes of form rather than substance, but they were nonetheless compromises. Rajaratnam once quipped of the Bangkok Declaration, ASEAN's founding document, and I quote him, "It was a very difficult problem of trying to say nothing in about 10 pages, which we did," end quote. Now, this was only partially accurate. The Bangkok Declaration was more important for what it did not say than for what was explicitly stated. The Bangkok Declaration emphasized economic and other uncontroversial forms of cooperation. But for ASEAN's first quarter century, almost nothing was done to advance economic cooperation. There were more immediate political and security concerns, and irrespective of what the Bangkok Declaration said, these political and security concerns were ASEAN's real concerns. Whatever our other differences, all the 5 founding members were anti-communist or non-communist. The realization was that if we did not hang together, we would hang separately. The Soviet Union and Mao's China were not entirely inaccurate in their characterization of ASEAN as a Cold War organization. But such a characterization captured only part of the ASEAN reality. Most members were non-communist, but non-aligned. In 1969, the Nixon or Guam doctrine made clear that regional states would have to take greater responsibility for their own defense. And the fall of Indochina to communist rule in 1975 gave greater urgency to regionalism as a bulwark against communism. After reunification in 1975, Hanoi began to speak ominously of bringing, and I quote, genuine independence to Southeast Asia. Genuine independence. In 1976, in response to events on the mainland in Indochina, ASEAN held its first summit in Bali and signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, or TAC, which was open to accession by other Southeast Asian countries. Now, explicit defense cooperation was still too sensitive. The first ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting was not held until 2006. But TAC was nevertheless the first attempt by regional states to formally prescribe peaceful norms of behavior and conflict settlement for the entire region. Previously, these ideas had more or less been imposed on the region by external powers who had their own preferences. But it cannot be said that the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation was a resounding success from the beginning. None of the other Southeast Asian countries signed on. Even the friendliest major power gave the treaty only cursory attention. And on Christmas Day, 1978, only 2 years after the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation was signed, Vietnam, with the support of the Soviet Union, invaded Kampuchea, as Cambodia was then named. Hanoi quickly overthrew the Khmer Rouge and installed a puppet government that gave, of which Hun Sen, the current Prime Minister of Cambodia, was a member. He was Foreign Minister. This gave focus to ASEAN's fears and purpose to ASEAN cooperation. Beijing withdrew support for Southeast Asian communist insurgencies and adopted ASEAN's vision of regionalism, at least tactically. Differences were downplayed and postponed. Now, the Cambodian conflict was a Sino-Soviet proxy war that it was never in ASEAN's power to resolve. This was a big boys' game. ASEAN's role was to rally international support to prevent a Soviet-backed Vietnamese fait accompli. And this was a limited but not inconsequential role which we performed very successfully. Foreign service officers of my generation learned our trade in the decade of the 1980s, dealing with the Cambodian issue in a variety of forms and forums. Now, I said a limited but not inconsequential role which we performed very successfully. And ASEAN held the line until the global constellation of forces shifted, the Cold War wound down, and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council forged a settlement under UN auspices. Indonesia facilitated the endgame diplomacy, but the Cambodian settlement was, as I said earlier, essentially a big boys' game. Our handling of the Cambodian issue nevertheless enhanced ASEAN's international reputation. The complicated intra-ASEAN diplomacy of the Cambodian issue, which was far more difficult than the external dimensions, gave us greater confidence and experience in managing the intricacies of regionalism. Our sense of regionalism's possibilities began to expand. But insofar that ASEAN was at least partially a Cold War organization, the end of the Cold War and the expansion of membership to include 2 communist states posed a fundamental question. What was going to be ASEAN's post-Cold War raison d'etre? What are we going to do now that the Cold War was over? The answer was to try and do what we had always said was our purpose: economic cooperation. The Cold War, you can date it, I guess, from 1991 when the Soviet Union imploded, the end of the Cold War. The Singapore summit was held a year later, 1992. And that summit formally adopted the ASEAN Free Trade Area, AFTA, with the goal of economic integration. Progress was slow and uneven, and AFTA's ambition was limited, in fact, quite modest. It was difficult to muster the will to take the political decisions that economic cooperation required without the existential challenges of the Cold War as a spur. Still, the first phase of ASEAN economic integration was completed as scheduled at the end of 2015. At least enough was completed for us to credibly declare an end to that phase. And the second phase of regional economic integration, due for completion in 2025, is now underway with more ambitious targets of a common market and common production platform. We shall have to wait and see if they can be achieved, and perhaps we can discuss this a little bit when we take questions and answers. Well, the subsequent ASEAN story is better known. The ASEAN Regional Forum, or ARF, the East Asia Summit, EAS, and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, while often derided as talk shops, are nevertheless now central forums for East Asian multilateral diplomacy. There are no other forums. In 2007, the ASEAN Charter was signed, which gave the organization, hence the idea of Southeast Asia, a more formal and institutionalized character. And I've lost count of the number of countries, some very far away, who have acceded to or aspire to accede to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. but they now include all 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and all the major Asian powers. 3 of the permanent members and the major Asia-Pacific powers are now also ASEAN dialogue partners. Now, it's become something of a cliche to credit ASEAN with keeping the peace in Southeast Asia for more than 50 years. A cliche is not necessarily untrue. It's only something so often repeated to be taken for granted as obvious. And it is true that ASEAN kept the peace. This is no mean achievement in a region where, as I said earlier, order and civility in relations was not to be taken for granted. However, the risk is that the obvious will obscure the underlying deeper realities that had to be overcome, mitigated, or accommodated for Southeast Asia to reach its present situation. So what lessons can we draw from this quick sketch of ASEAN's past? I think there are 4 interrelated lessons. First, nothing was inevitable. Many experiments in regionalism led to dead ends, many failed. Nothing is therefore to be taken for granted. Southeast Asia in 2019 is not the Southeast Asia of 1967. Time and the accumulated experience of working together has built mutual confidence and blunted the sharper edges of old animosities. ASEAN has eased the tensions, suspicions, and complications that I had outlined. But it did not erase them. They are still there, lurking beneath the surface civilities, and not so deeply buried as to prevent them from still occasionally surfacing in new forms, as we can see if you look north across the causeway. And we may still fail. ASEAN may still fail. The tensions, suspicions, and complications are the consequence of Southeast Asia's diversity. These are not diversities, not just the relatively superficial diversities of differences in political systems or levels of economic development, although those are great enough. In principle, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but in principle, political systems can converge and economic development even out. But the most important diversities in Southeast Asia are diversities which can be described as primordial, diversities of race, of language, and of religion, which in Southeast Asia are closely correlated, define core identities, and thus shape domestic and foreign policies. Primordial diversities can be managed, but they will never go away. It is improbable that ASEAN will disappear entirely as its precursors had disappeared, but ASEAN could well become irrelevant. As previously stressed, relevance has to be created by political will and sustained by political will. And this seems obvious. But there are signs that some ASEAN member states are now inclined to ignore the obvious or rest on ASEAN's laurels, or are reluctant to take the tough political decisions needed to move ASEAN further forward. Of course, as earlier mentioned, ASEAN's trajectory has not been and will never be a straight line, and we will always move forward by lurches and meanderings. But this is not an automatic process. Second lesson. Indonesia was key. The essential reason why ASEAN survived, whereas earlier experiments in regionalism did not, boils down to the difference between Sukarno's Indonesia and Suharto's Indonesia. Suharto's priority was on economic development. He was no less a nationalist than Sukarno and also believed that Indonesia was entitled to lead. But unlike Sukarno, he saw development and the stability that regionalism would create as the only practical means of exercising leadership. Suharto's Indonesia accepted the principle of decision-making by consensus and its corollary, non-interference, rather than try to impose Indonesia's will by fiat or by force. Suharto's approach was pithily summarized by an Indonesian slogan whose basic point was essentially similar to Rajaratnam's idea of the regional interest being part of the national interest. And the slogan is this: national resilience enhances regional resilience, and regional resilience enhances national resilience. Consensus and non-interference have been modified in practice, but despite their obvious limitations, cannot be abandoned as ASEAN's core operating principles. The simple reason being what I have already stated. All the differences that made regionalism simultaneously so necessary and so hard to achieve have not disappeared and will never disappear. They therefore have to be managed if the peace is to be kept. Consensus reassures the small that the big cannot impose their will on them. Consensus reassures the big that the small cannot gang up on them. ASEAN's most fundamental consideration, the thing that is always in our mind, our most fundamental consideration is to preserve the organization even if it means inaction or consensus only of form. Any other mode of decision-making risks even small differences escalating into serious conflicts. Now, it cannot be denied that the expansion of ASEAN membership, while desirable or at any rate now irreversible, has made reaching consensus more difficult. Expansion of membership has expanded the diversity of national interests that needs to be reconciled, and it's obviously harder for 10 to agree than 5 or 6. Some new members have a weaker sense of the imperative of finding a balance between national and regional interests. Under Cambodia's chairmanship in 2012, it proved impossible to reach consensus on a text on the South China Sea, resulting in the entire foreign minister's joint statement being scrapped for the first time in ASEAN's history. Acting at China's behest, the chair, then Foreign Minister Ho Nam Hong, clearly did not understand the importance of finding such a balance and was determined from the beginning to reject any consensus on this issue. I was there representing our minister. Many ministers got together and came up with a document. They gave it to Ho Nam Hong. He was sitting in the chair waiting like that. He looked at the document, he didn't read it, he just threw it on the table. He was not interested in even finding any consensus. He was determined from the beginning to reject any consensus on this issue. And this was extremely short-sighted on the part of both China and Cambodia. It was a serious setback for ASEAN. Fortunately, within a week after the Cambodia meeting, due to the tireless efforts of then Indonesian Foreign Minister Marty Natalegawa, ASEAN was able to find a minimal consensus on the South China Sea. This consensus has, with nuances reflecting the interests and attitudes of subsequent chairs, so far held. Perhaps the near-death experience has taught something to both China and those ASEAN members inclined to act as Beijing's stalking horses. At any rate, the 2012 fiasco has not, so far, touch wood, been repeated. It is futile to deny nationalism and the human need for identity. Consensus decision-making is a means of accommodating nationalism by reassuring each member that the basic value that whatever their other differences, all nationalists hold in common, and that value is autonomy, can be upheld by working together without the risk of one nationalism being overwhelmed by another. Regionalism based on nationalism may seem a contradiction in terms, and it is to some degree a contradiction in terms, but it works in practice, although sometimes, perhaps too often, at the cost of suboptimal outcomes. But that is the unavoidable price we pay for having any sort of regional organization. But there are new challenges. As I mentioned in my first lecture, we live in an age when identities of various kinds, ethnic, religious, and secular, are being more insistently asserted. This is a global trend from which Southeast Asia has not been insulated. And it is not yet clear how this will affect Indonesian and other Southeast Asian nationalisms, and therefore ASEAN. National resilience and regional resilience reinforcing each other begs a basic question. What will they be used for? There are some signs of Indonesia being tempted to believe that it has outgrown Southeast Asia. Now, the third lesson that I take from the short sketch of ASEAN's history is that domestic politics and domestic political changes were the crucial determinants of the direction of Southeast Asian regionalism. The turning point in the evolution of ASEAN was the failed 1965 coup in Indonesia, which led to the destruction of the PKI, Partai Komunis Indonesia, and Sukarno's fall. Suharto's new order made possible a new Southeast Asian order. The general point is that ASEAN is an organization of sovereign states that can do no more than what its members, by the exercise of their sovereignties, allow it to do. We have no supranational ambitions. The domestic politics of its members will therefore continue to be the key factor shaping ASEAN's future and its ability to be an effective instrument of ours and other member states' foreign policy. Nation building and the consolidation of the state are still ongoing processes in Southeast Asia, where several states are still internally contested. Some of the contestations on the borderlands, where minority groups have different notions of both state and nation than their capitals, are violent. The political systems of ASEAN members are thus still evolving, and in some key cases, evolving systemically and not just through routine electoral changes. I don't believe that Indonesia has yet reached a stable post-Suharto political equilibrium. Malaysia may be on the crux of a systemic political change driven by religion and demographics. I'm not referring to the result of last year's election. That's a change of government, not system. But the system is becoming more Malay and more Islamic for reasons I mentioned briefly in my lecture, my last lecture. At some point, these quantitative changes will become qualitative changes. Thai politics after 2006 has been bedeviled by political instability. The situation for now appears stable, but the underlying fundamental causes have been frozen, not resolved, and I doubt that the coming general election will resolve them. The direction of Myanmar's political development is unclear, and it is a biological certainty that the current highly personalized Cambodian political system will change. By biological certainty, I mean that Hun Sen will die. He doesn't believe it, but he will one day. It is unclear where these political changes and the others will take ASEAN. Furthermore, since state consolidation and nation building are still works in process and political systems still evolving, so too is region building an uncompleted project. Regionalism will always be a work in progress, but the direction cannot be assumed to have been set beyond the possibility of deflection. Just as some earlier experiments in regionalism ran into dead ends, so could ASEAN. The immediate, still debated issue is Timor-Leste's membership of ASEAN. The membership issue and the diplomatic history of regionalism in Southeast Asia underscores the fact that Southeast Asia is a political and not just geographic concept. That Southeast Asia's definition is not yet settled, coupled with the undeniable fact of China's re-emergence as a major power, carries more profound implications than just ASEAN membership for Timor-Leste. To adapt a phrase, will Southeast Asia become a region with pronounced Chinese characteristics? Fourth and final lesson, the role of major powers is crucial. The major powers have competed since the 1950s to try and influence Southeast Asian regionalism, but none of them have ever been able to shape the regional architecture entirely in accordance with their own preferences, although they exercise significant influence during certain periods. Southeast Asia is too complex and diverse a region, some might say too unruly a region, to be captured whole. It's like squeezing jello. Some bits will always slip through your fingers. The only time when a single power held sway over all of Southeast Asia was the brief and exceptional period of Japanese occupation during the Second World War. Post-war Dutch and French attempts to reimpose their will on colonial possessions failed. Britain made a virtue of necessity and tried to retain influence indirectly. The formation of Malaysia being an example of such tactics. Sukarno was not entirely wrong, you know. But it did not succeed either. America was the first Western power to relinquish colonial authority and initially supported Indonesian nationalist aspirations against the Dutch. But the Cold War soon and with increasing intensity pitted the US against one variant of Vietnamese nationalism in the Indochina Wars. Now, the focal points of Soviet and Chinese efforts to influence Southeast Asian regionalism were North Vietnam and Indonesia under Sukarno, in which the PKI was a major political force. Moscow poured massive amounts of military aid into North Vietnam and Indonesia. Maoist China was less able to afford material support, but Beijing did what it could for North Vietnam and in the 1950s arguably played a more crucial role than the Soviet Union. China also supported the PKI and Southeast Asian communist insurgencies politically and materially. As the Sino-Soviet dispute developed, Moscow and Beijing competed for influence against each other as well as against the US. The American military intervention in Vietnam was intended to prevent communism from spreading in Southeast Asia. The US failed on the mainland, but it bought time for the rest of the region to consolidate non-communist notions of regionalism, which eventually resulted in ASEAN. British and Commonwealth military interventions during the Malayan emergency defeated the Malayan Communist Party. They subsequently successfully defended Malaysia during Konfrontasi, preventing Sukarno's leftist and anti-Western idea of regionalism, one element of which was Indonesia Raya, or Greater Indonesia, from prevailing. Now, ASEAN was broadly in line with the American concept of regionalism in that it was non-communist. But ASEAN was not America's initial preference, which was for SEATO, which only 2 Southeast Asian countries joined. And only part of Southeast Asia was initially included in ASEAN, whose aspiration was for a ZOFAN, Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality, which in principle rejected American as well as communist ideas of regionalism. ASEAN member states did not embrace American values or conform to American ideas of political development. But Moscow and Beijing did not succeed either. Despite generous Soviet aid, the PKI and Sukarno's Indonesia tilted towards China. And when the Chinese-backed 1965 coup failed, China's position in Indonesia collapsed entirely. Reunified Vietnam aligned itself with the Soviet Union. After its occupation of Cambodia, China invaded Vietnam in 1979 to teach Hanoi a lesson and supported ASEAN. When the Cold War ended, the Cambodian issue was settled and ASEAN expanded to include all 10 countries of Southeast Asia. Only one idea of Southeast Asian regionalism seemed to be left standing. The major power contest to shape Southeast Asian regionalism is, however, not over. It has only taken a new form. The contest now takes place within and over ASEAN. No major power now seeks to destroy or replace ASEAN. Instead, they seek to capture it. Why? Because we are located at the strategic intersection of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. So Southeast Asia will always be an arena of major power competition. ZOFAN and SHORNFIS, the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, which is supposed to be a component of ZOFAN, were failed attempts to finesse this uncomfortable situation through the superficially appealing but totally unrealistic idea of excluding the major powers from Southeast Asia. The terms ZOFAN and SHORNFIS linger on in the ASEAN lexicon, but without much substance, because language cannot overcome geopolitical reality. The concept of ASEAN centrality is another term more often used and understood, takes a more realistic approach to the same challenge than ZOFAN and SHORNFIS. ASEAN centrality does not futilely seek to exclude the major powers. Instead, it tries to leverage on the unavoidable. ASEAN centrality is not a reflection of ASEAN's strategic weight in the East Asian strategic equation. The focal point of that equation has always been in the northeast, not the southeast. But by inviting all the major powers to participate in forums such as the ARF, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus, and making all the major powers dialogue partners, ASEAN can be useful, that is to say, central, because these forums and ASEAN itself are coherent enough to serve as supplementary instruments for the major powers to advance their interests in Southeast Asia, while not so strong as to be able to stymie their most vital designs. In 2016, a Chinese vice minister, in the presence of Foreign Minister Wang Yi, bluntly told the ASEAN foreign ministers that as far as the South China Sea was concerned, ASEAN was not central. Wang Yi did not contradict his subordinate. The vice minister was rude, but he was not entirely wrong. His attitude was not exceptional. ASEAN was not central to American and European policy towards Myanmar under military rule, although they were generally more polite about it. Still, the concept of ASEAN centrality, as I have explained it, preserves at least some autonomy by promoting a balance of major powers in Southeast Asia. Balance in this sense is not directed against any major power. Rather, it is an omnidirectional and dynamic state of equilibrium of all major powers that gives ASEAN maneuver room and thus some degree of voice and agency. The degree of autonomy varies from issue to issue and ebbs and flows over time. This is not an ideal situation, but it is the best possible situation in the real world. However, a key question still remains. Can ASEAN avoid capture by China or any other major power? Now, from 1967 to around 1991, ASEAN primarily served Western interests as a de facto adjunct to the US alliance system. There was, in fact, no other option for a non-communist regional organization at that time. From 1972 to 1989, given its concerns about the Soviet Union, China was also a de facto member of the same system. Since then, faced with a resurgent China freed of the constraints of the Sino-Soviet conflict, the US has sought to preserve as much as possible of the status quo and an East Asian architecture built around its hub and spokes alliance system. America is clearly dominant in this system, but dominant within the Westphalian norm of formal sovereign equality. Such a system structurally maximizes the scope for small states to exercise agency, provided no vital US interest is at stake. And of course, provided the small state has the will, the wit, and the agility to take advantage of the opportunities. The terms rules-based order and more recently a free and open Indo-Pacific are code words for this system. Now, China. Sorry. What the hell? Jesus Christ. China wants its new status acknowledged. This is a reasonable and legitimate aspiration. But China holds the concept of sovereign equality very lightly, if at all. Beijing seems to want its status acknowledged not merely as a geopolitical fact, but as a new hierarchical norm of East Asian international relations with China at the apex. This is an entirely different matter from recognizing a geopolitical fact. China under Xi Jinping now insistently promotes the Belt and Road Initiative as a central organizing vision in which all roads lead to Beijing. The hierarchical order structurally minimizes the scope for agency of small states. And the South China Sea has become something of a proxy for the contest between American and Chinese ideas of regionalism. It must be admitted that ASEAN has not exactly covered itself with glory on this issue, but it is beyond ASEAN's capabilities to resolve the disputes in the South China Sea. As with the Cambodian issue in the 1980s, this is a big boys game. But strategically, at the big boys level, the South China Sea is a stalemate. Nobody can make the Chinese drop their claim to almost the entire South China Sea, or make them dig up the artificial islands it has constructed and throw the sand back into the sea. Beijing will certainly deploy military assets on the islands, perhaps only periodically, perhaps permanently. But, crucially, China cannot stop the US and its allies operating in, through, and over the South China Sea without risking war. If war breaks out, those islands and the military assets on them are only targets. Overall, the US is still militarily dominant, and China cannot prevail in a war with the US, and a loss will put the rule of the Chinese Communist Party at risk. I doubt the Chinese Communist Party will gamble. The stakes are just too high. Stalemate in the South China Sea is not ideal, but in situations short of war, that is to say for the purpose of day-to-day diplomacy, it does preserve maneuver space for ASEAN. Of course, whether we can muster the will, the wit to use the space is another matter. At any rate, no ASEAN claimant has had to give up their claims. We pay more attention to the sea. The land is as important, and in the long run perhaps even more important. China, by virtue of proximity and weight, will always exercise significant influence in Southeast Asia. China's natural gravitational pull is being enhanced by various infrastructure projects. Rail lines under construction or planned run from north to south through Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. There are, by some counts, 21 dams completed under construction or planned in China along the upper reaches of the Mekong River. The Mekong runs through Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, half of ASEAN. These projects have geopolitical consequences, intended or not. They could, in effect, merge Southwest China and mainland Southeast Asia into one economic space. International boundaries will, of course, remain as lines on maps, but they could well be relegated to inconveniences or irrelevancies. Herein lies the geopolitical significance of ASEAN's economic integration project. Nobody wants to cut themselves off from the economic benefits that China offers. That would be foolish. But if China succeeds in creating a common market and common production platform, this will preserve an economically coherent and authentically Southeast Asian countervailing concept of region that will enable us to enjoy the synergies of contiguity with China without subordinating entities. The next phase of ASEAN economic integration will require very hard political decisions on intrinsically complex issues such as non-tariff barriers, services, and in some degree, labor mobility. The political changes underway I earlier mentioned do not make this the most propitious of times to take tough decisions. Still, even recognizing this and other constraints, a certain timidity or sense of fatalism has crept into ASEAN decision-making and the manner in which different chairs, Singapore not excluded, conceive of their role in ASEAN and the organization's potentiality. We and other member states have perhaps begun to underestimate the degree of agency ASEAN can have. This is dangerous. As I had observed in an earlier lecture, sometimes the greatest risk is unwillingness to take risks. This is not to say that ASEAN will inevitably fail, nor is it to say that we will inevitably succeed either. The history of regionalism in Southeast Asia is replete with contingencies, and there is still a whole lot of history left to unfold. And what is the alternative? And on that question, I will end this lecture.